In my last few videos, I talked about using prebiotics like fiber to deliver nutrients to the colon for the sustained and prolonged release of appetite-reducing gut hormones like GLP-1. That's because the majority of cells producing GLP-1 are located at the end of the gut in our large intestine. But prebiotics don't represent the only slow digestion-oriented dietary strategy to sustain the secretion of GLP-1. Prebiotics can be used to promote metabolic health and longevity by stimulating intestinal production of GLP-1, and so too can the drug acarbose, which acts as a starch blocker, inhibiting the enzymes that would normally digest carbohydrates earlier in the small intestine. Acarbose-induced transfer of carbs to the lower parts of the intestine increases GLP-1 levels, and since changes in GLP-1 correlate with weight loss in those on the drug, it's reasonable to suspect that GLP-1 is a mediator of the favorable impacts of acarbose therapy on weight control. There's also a third strategy, eating Lente carbohydrates, from the Latin lentus for slow. Instead of taking a drug to slow dietary carbohydrate digestion, what about just choosing a diet centered around slow-digesting Lente carbohydrates to achieve comparable benefits? That's the theory, anyway. So that means pasta, beans, groats, meaning structurally intact grain kernels, as well as sprouted grains. Let's start with beans. Here, researchers found enhanced secretion of satiety-promoting gut hormones after the consumption of white bread that had been enriched with coarsely ground chickpea flour, and the more chickpea it contained, the higher the GLP-1 levels spiked. But where are you going to find chickpea bread? What about just eating beans? Asking people to eat 5 cups of beans a week spontaneously led to health benefits similar to those seen after asking people to cut 500 calories out of their daily diet. But there was no change in GLP-1 levels. What about cocoa beans? I wish, but sadly no effect of dark chocolate on GLP-1 either. The one pasta study I could find also failed to bump GLP-1, but the one sprouted grain study I found showed higher GLP-1 response to sprouted bread compared to 4 other types of bread, which didn't differ significantly from each other. 11 or 12 grain bread was no different than white bread? That's what's generally found when comparing products made with whole grain flour to refined grain flour. There aren't any immediate right-after-the-meal effects of whole wheat bread compared to white bread, for example. You can't just eat bread and expect some kind of Groatzempic effect, because, as I explained in my last few videos, food structure is critical for optimal health. When grains are milled into flour, whether whole wheat or white, their cell walls are ruptured, and the starch spills out and never makes it down to our colon, so we don't get their added benefit. This is one of the reasons former Harvard nutrition chair Walt Willett has argued that the term whole grain should probably be reserved for only whole intact grain kernels, otherwise known as groats, the holiest of grains. In my book, How Not to Diet, I talk about my BROL bowl, a prebiotic mix that includes barley groats, rye groats, and oat groats. What effect might they have on GLP-1? If you give people bread containing some whole intact barley groats, there's no immediate difference in GLP-1 levels in the subsequent 3 hours, but the groats wouldn't even have had time to make it down to your colon that quickly. However, after your good bacteria have had a chance to break open their cell walls, you get a greater, higher GLP-1 bump more than 12 hours later at breakfast the next day. The question, though, is whether that translates into a suppressed appetite, and indeed, lower food intake, not just at breakfast, but also at lunch the next day, 14 hours later. Having barley kernels at an evening meal not only increased GLP-1 the next day, boosting blood levels by 43% at breakfast, but feelings of hunger decreased during the entire next day, and the research participants ate about 100 fewer calories of an all-you-can-eat lunch just because they had some barley groats 14 hours before. Eat barley groats 3 days in a row, and on the 4th they see a 56% increase in the level of GLP-1 in your blood. What about rye groats? Eat rye groats for supper, and more than 10 hours later, your GLP-1 levels are up, and your appetite is down. Researchers found that participants had an increased subjective feeling of satiety during the course of the entire next day. So rye groats demonstrate anti-diabetes and anti-obesity potential as manifested by enhanced blood sugar control and increased GLP-1 and the accompanying appetite suppression. And there was a correlation between the short-chain fatty acids acetate and propionate and GLP-1 response, suggesting that indeed we may have our good gut bugs to thank for the beneficial effects.